Under the blistering sun of a Tuesday afternoon, the skies over Dhaka split with a deafening roar. At first, it was just another flyby, a routine military drill the locals had long grown numb to, even when the windows trembled. But within moments, what should have been a standard training sortie turned into a fireball of metal, glass, and terror. The Bangladesh Air Force F-7BGI jet, moments after takeoff from Kurmitala Air Base, plummeted like a dead weight into Milestone School and College in the densely populated Udara district. The impact was instant and catastrophic. The explosion tore through classrooms filled with children reciting poetry and multiplication tables, their innocence shattered in a flash of fire and debris. By the time the flames were doused and the thick black smoke gave way to a surreal silence, 31 lives had been extinguished, 25 of them children. Over 170 others lay injured. Many of them were burned so severe their own families could not recognize them. One teacher, hailed posthumously as a hero, died shielding her students from the inferno. In that instant, a classroom became a battlefield, and a generation's sense of safety was irreversibly scorched. Welcome to What If Horizons, the podcast where we ask the hard questions about moments that shake the world and the futures they might unlock. I'm your host, and today we confront a chilling question born out of horror. What if the Bangladesh jet crash becomes a catalyst for global military aviation safety reforms? It is easy after disasters to grieve and then forget, but some events cleave so deep they leave permanent fault lines in our collective conscience. This crash is one of them. Overnight, grief in Dhaka morphed into fury. The gates of Milestone School became a shrine of flowers, candles, and rage. Crowds demanded answers, accountability, and change. Students filled the streets, their uniforms stained not with ink or dirt, but with ash and sorrow. Social media erupted with footage too graphic for prime time, spreading the trauma globally. Hashtags like Ground the F-7 and Justice for Uttara children trended worldwide. As ambulances wailed and helicopters circled overhead, the question was no longer how this happened, but how many more times it might happen elsewhere. It is not just about one aging jet or one tragic neighborhood. This is about a global military aviation system that often flies under the radar, literally and figuratively, when it comes to oversight, accountability, and safety. If this disaster forces nations to look skyward not with awe, but with urgency, then perhaps something can rise from the ashes. Not redemption, for some wounds do not heal, but transformation. In today's episode, we will dissect this tragedy from all angles, the history of the aircraft, the risk patterns long ignored, and the potential domino effect this crash could unleash on military aviation worldwide. Could this calamity finally ground dangerous fleets clean to outdated Cold War-era designs? Might it force a reckoning not just in Bangladesh, but in Pakistan, Iran, Nigeria, and other countries still flying relics into populated skies? Could military air forces be forced to finally abide by the same rigorous safety protocols demanded of civilian carriers? And what would that mean for geopolitics, defense spending, and the power dynamics between Western arms manufacturers and their global clients? The stakes are as high as the altitude from which that doomed F-7BGI fell. In the minutes and hours that follow, we are going to dive deep into a world of metal fatigue, procurement politics, and aerial arrogance. Buckle in, because this ride begins not in the clouds, but in the crater at a schoolyard in Dhaka. To understand how a Chinese-made jet ended up diving nose first into a schoolyard in the middle of Bangladesh's capital, we have to first unravel the ancient, creaking bones of the aircraft itself. The F-7BGI is not some cutting-edge stealth fighter built in the last decade. It is, in essence, a retrofitted relic, a modernized version of the Chinese Chengdu F-7, which itself is a Chinese version of the Soviet MiG-21. Yes, the same MiG-21 that was first rolled out during the Khrushchev era, back when people thought smoking was healthy and computers filled entire rooms. In short, this was not a plane built for modern airspace, especially not for weaving through civilian air corridors in a densely populated urban sprawl like Dhaka. The Bangladesh Air Force, like many air forces in the global south, has long depended on affordable imports from China to maintain a semblance of deterrence. But affordable in defense procurement usually comes with a hidden cost. These jets, while gleaming in military parades, are notorious among aviation circles for their maintenance headaches, their clunky avionics, and their tendency to handle like a lid refrigerator at high speeds. And while China has continued to sell upgraded versions of these aircraft, the BGI being one of the newer models, the core design remains fundamentally unchanged, fast, brutal, and entirely unforgiving of error. So why, in the 2020s, would a nation still be flying jets based on a design first tested during the Cold War? The answer, as with most matters of national defense, is budget. Bangladesh allocates around 1.2% of its gross domestic product to defense spending, a figure far below the global average. Modern jets like the American F-16 or even the Swedish Gripen would be a fantasy for a military operating on such limited funds. The F-7 BGI was the compromise, a shiny enough object to satisfy politicians and parade photographers, cheap enough to buy in bulk, and ostensibly reliable enough for basic airspace patrol and pilot training. That last part, pilot training, is the rub. You see, the F-7 BGI in question was being operated by a flight trainee on a routine exercise, and therein lies the structural tragedy. These jets, originally designed as interceptors with very little tolerance for error, are notoriously ill-suited for use in pilot training. Their limited visibility, high landing speed, and twitchy controls make them about as beginner-friendly as a chainsaw on a unicycle. But when your military has neither the budget for dedicated training jets nor the infrastructure for simulators, you send your cadets up in whatever you have. It is a practice not unique to Bangladesh. India's aging fleet of MiG-21s, dubbed the flying coffins by its own pilots, has been the cause of dozens of fatal crashes over the years. Pakistan's Chinese origin aircraft have suffered similar mishaps, with inquiries often disappearing into bureaucratic black holes. In fact, around the developing world, there exists a shadow ecosystem of military air forces flying hand-me-down jets from bygone superpowers. It is like a global yard sale of military hardware, where every purchase comes with a tacit understanding, buyer beware. But the consequences of those purchases do not fall on the generals, or the defense ministers, or the state-owned arms dealers grinning across mahogany desks. They fall on neighborhoods, on schoolyards, on families. And now the world has seen what that looks like. Blood on playgrounds, chalkboards scorched black, small shoes among the wreckage. It is hard to spin that into a press release. This is not about pointing fingers at one nation. It is about exposing a pattern, a reckless, underfunded, and underregulated approach to military aviation in developing nations supported by defense exporters who know better but sell anyway. The crash in Dhaka, tragic as it is, might just be the moment the world wakes up to a reality long whispered about in think tank corridors and classified memos. Because when a trainer jet slams into a school, it is no longer a military issue. It is a civilian one, a public safety issue, a global responsibility. And while international aviation bodies have long imposed strict safety standards on civilian airlines, standards so exacting they would make your average commercial pilot weep, military aviation exists in a kind of Wild West, answerable only to national command structures that often have more interest in secrecy than safety. Could this change? Could we see a new Geneva Convention-style framework for military air safety? Could arms exporting countries be held liable for the safety records of the jets they sell? Could the next generation of fighter pilots be trained on simulators instead of death traps? If there is any justice left at 30,000 feet, the answer must be yes. But we are not there yet. For now, the debris lies in Dhaka, waiting for investigators. And the world watches, if only for a moment, before the next crisis blinks across the screen. The morning after the crash, as cleanup crews picked through the mangled remains of both jet and building, something strange happened. Not strange in the conspiratorial sense, though those would come, but in the bureaucratically surreal way only governments can deliver. The Bangladesh Air Force released a press statement referring to the crash as a training incident, resulting in the unfortunate destruction of property. That's right, not a tragedy, not a catastrophe, not even a loss of life, just a training incident. The wording was so sterile you could use it to disinfect a wound. And that's the moment it became clear this wasn't just about one jet. It was about an entire culture of denial, an institutional habit of sweeping failures under the runway carpet and hoping nobody notices the bloodstains. But this time, people noticed. The photos went viral. Satellite imagery showed the crater where the school once stood. News outlets from Tokyo to Toronto scrambled for details. And for a brief flickering moment, the world's eyes were locked on Dhaka, not for fashion or cricket or climate resilience, but because a supersonic symbol of neglect had come roaring out of the sky. Within 24 hours, the airwaves were crawling with commentators. Some pointed to technical failure. Others suspected pilot error. A few online forums, those deep, murky pools of aviation geeks and defense analysts, started dissecting the tail number of the aircraft, cross-referencing its maintenance logs, looking for patterns. And all the patterns were there. That particular jet had a history. Minor glitches. A fuel calibration anomaly. An instance of radio failure during landing the year before. Nothing that would ground it, nothing that would even be flagged in a Western Air Force, but enough to know it wasn't exactly the safest thing to be throwing into urban airspace. Which brings us to a simple question. Why was it flying over a school at all? According to the official training route, the jet was supposed to perform a series of altitude drills over a designated corridor to the west of Dhaka. But for reasons still under investigation, the aircraft deviated from its path. Eyewitnesses reported strange engine noises before it nosedived. One witness described the plane as wobbling and tilted at an angle, like it was fighting itself. Another claimed the pilot ejected moments before impact. But here's the chilling part. No ejection seat was found, no parachute, no trace of the pilot, at least not initially. For hours, rumors swirled that the pilot had survived and gone into hiding. Conspiracy theorists had a field day. Was he kidnapped? Defecting? Taken into custody by intelligence agents? The truth, as it turned out, was even bleaker. The pilot's remains were found amid the rubble, unrecognizable. He had not ejected. He had tried to steer the aircraft away from the school. Witnesses later confirmed the sharp banking turn seconds before the crash, but had run out of altitude, options, and time. His name was Flight Officer Rashid Karim, 23 years old, the son of a textile worker from Narayanganj. He had graduated top of his class. His dream, according to his friends, had always been to touch the sky. He did, just not the way he'd hoped. And now his legacy is tied not to his skill, not to his dedication, but to the bureaucratic inertia that put him in a flying coffin and told him to smile for the parade. There's a cruelty in that. A young man trusted the system. And the system trusted a jet that should have been scrapped 10 years ago. But in the shadowy world of defense procurement, scrapping old hardware is not just inconvenient, it's politically dangerous. Think about it. If you admit a fleet is unsafe, you admit your procurement policy was flawed. If you ground the aircraft, you signal weakness to neighbors and rivals. If you replace the fleet, you need funding, massive funding, and that means convincing lawmakers, most of whom wouldn't know a cockpit from a carburetor. So instead, the charade continues. Shiny jets polished for photo ops, flown by brave but underprepared cadets, patched together by overstretched maintenance crews, and defended by press officers fluent in euphemism. It is an illusion of strength built on the bones of risk. Bangladesh is not alone in this. The same scenario plays out in different languages across Asia, Africa, Latin America. Jet crashes in Egypt blamed on weather conditions. Sudden disappearances in Indonesia attributed to technical anomalies, all wrapped in the familiar blanket of training incident. And the world nods. Because we have normalized military accidents the way we once normalized factory fires and mine collapses, part at the cost of doing business. Until the call shows up in a classroom, until desks are caved in and chalk dust mixes with jet fuel, until a boy's notebook is found under landing gear. Then suddenly the illusion breaks. Briefly, tragically, but maybe, just maybe, long enough for change to begin. The ripple effects of the crash extended far beyond the blackened ruins of the schoolyard. In the days that followed, national headlines turned from solemn to indignant. Public outcry swelled, not just from grieving parents or outraged teachers, but from ordinary citizens suddenly grappling with an existential question. If a military jet can fall out of the sky on a regular Thursday, what else are we pretending is safe? Candlelight vigils lit up the streets of Dhaka. Students marched with handmade signs that said things like, "Our classrooms are not your airfields," and "Scrap the junk, not our future." The media, always quick to pivot from tragedy to scandal, began digging deeper. Leaked documents emerged showing the Air Force had internally flagged that jet for possible decommissioning over a year prior. The maintenance report, obtained by an anonymous whistleblower and splashed across the front pages, contained chilling phrases like airframe fatigue beyond tolerance and incomplete avionics diagnostics. Translation? That thing had no business flying. It should have been stripped for parts, not launched over a civilian population. But it was, because it was cheaper. Because defense budgets are political puzzles, and optics often outweigh operational readiness. No politician wants to be photographed next to a grounded fighter jet. The optics say, weak. So they keep the birds in the air, even when the wings are metaphorical duct tape. In the face of growing outrage, the government tried its best damage control routine. They announced a full investigation, promised transparency, set up an inquiry committee. They even suspended a mid-level maintenance officer, someone barely connected to the incident. A sacrificial lamb handed to the mob to buy time. But time was on their side. The international press had arrived. CNN, Al Jazeera, BBC, all carrying the same angle. Aging jets, questionable safety, children killed. Suddenly, Bangladesh wasn't just grappling with grief, it was grappling with image. And for a government obsessed with economic development, infrastructure pride, and foreign investment, that was intolerable. Quietly, emergency meetings were held. Defense officials were summoned. Foreign advisors were consulted. There was talk of grounding the entire fleet of similar aircraft, but that move would cripple training operations. Replacing the jets would cost billions, money that didn't exist in the budget and couldn't be borrowed fast enough. So, as is so often the case in post-colonial democracies with fragile civil-military balances, they did what they knew best. They announced reforms. Reforms with long implementation timelines, vague wording, and no binding enforcement. There would be new safety protocols, they said. Modernization efforts, partnerships with friendly governments, training upgrades, digital maintenance tracking. It all sounded impressive until one read the fine print. Almost everything announced had already been proposed years earlier in a dusty defense white paper. Nothing had been implemented then, and nothing would be now unless the anger stayed hot, which is where social media came in. TikTok videos showed school children reciting poems about the crash. Instagram posts shared before and after satellite photos of the neighborhood. Hashtags like #JetJustice and #GroundTheFleet trended for days. Influencers, actors, and even a few retired officers began voicing their support. It was for a brief moment a national reckoning, and yet, like all reckonings, it faced headwinds. Detractors accused the media of demonizing the military. Some claimed the children were in fact playing in an unauthorized part of the compound, subtly shifting blame. A few opportunistic politicians used the moment to attack rivals rather than address the system. The machinery of misdirection began grinding into motion. And then something unexpected happened. An engineer, young, soft-spoken, clearly nervous, appeared on a talk show and delivered a devastating critique. Not of the government, not even of the military, but of the entire defense procurement process. He explained how Bangladesh, like many countries, buys military aircraft not based on operational need, but based on geopolitical favors. Sometimes jets come as part of diplomatic sweeteners. Sometimes they're bundled in broader deals involving telecom infrastructure or grain imports. Often, they're second-hand old Soviet models refurbished in Belarus or Chinese variants of 1970s designs, offered at cut-rate prices and bought with minimal transparency. These are not weapons, he said. They're symbols, flying billboards for foreign alliances. And the ones who maintain them? Underpaid, undertrained, and outnumbered. The clip went viral. Not because he was charismatic, but because he was right. It exposed a rot few dare name aloud that modern air forces in the developing world are often more about perception than protection. That lives in the calculus of military pride are sometimes just unfortunate variables. That this crash wasn't a freak event. It was the inevitable result of a system held together by hope and habit. And once that became clear, a deeper question emerged, not just among the citizens of Bangladesh, but among observers across the globe. If we can't trust the skies, what else have we been falsely reassured is under control? In the weeks that followed, the crash site was cleared and fenced, as if physical containment could also seal away the fury. A modest memorial plaque was placed by the Ministry of Education, words etched in stone to remember the children, though few remembered the ministry's past promises to upgrade school safety in urban zones. Grief hardened into frustration, and frustration took on many forms. Some called for immediate resignations from the Air Force's senior leadership. Others demanded an international audit of Bangladesh's military fleet. But amid the fog of proposals and performative outrage, one voice emerged with unsettling clarity, the voice of the surviving pilot. Though initially kept under strict medical isolation, he eventually recorded a video statement from his hospital bed. His face bruised, his voice trembling, he said what few expected to hear. "I knew the plane was dying," he said. "The cockpit alarms had become part of every flight. We called it flying blind with a prayer." He described manual overrides used routinely, radar systems that misfired during maneuvers, and mechanics who cannibalized parts from other jets just to make one barely flight-worthy. He claimed his last pre-flight check had shown faults, multiple, yet pressure from command had overridden caution. "If I had refused the mission," he said, "it would have gone on my record as insubordination." The recording broke the internet. News anchors replayed it every hour. Retired officers scrambled to dismiss him as disgruntled or mentally unwell, but it was too late. The illusion of competence had cracked. The system had been indicted by one of its own. What followed was not just institutional embarrassment, it was paralysis. The military halted non-essential flights. Emergency reviews began, some legitimate, others just bureaucratic theater. International partners, previously eager to sell more aircraft, now worried about reputational risks. Defense attaches started whispering behind closed doors. Could this scandal unravel broader military cooperation deals? Could a domestic safety issue derail regional defense diplomacy? The concern wasn't limited to Bangladesh. Around Asia and Africa, other nations quietly reviewed their aging fleets. Some had bought the same Soviet-era jets under similar sweetheart deals. If a crash like this could happen in Dhaka, could it happen in Nairobi? Or Manila? Or Tehran? Suddenly, what began as a local tragedy felt like a global preview of what happens when post-colonial militaries lean too hard on legacy tech and too lightly on accountability. Within Bangladesh, activists shifted their demands. It was no longer just about one crash or even one fleet, it was about structural transparency. They began calling for an open access military procurement database, for whistleblower protections within the armed forces, for annual public audits of airworthiness and safety. Predictably, these proposals were met with cold silence from Parliament. But the civilian population was no longer in a listening mood. They wanted action. Parents pulled children from schools located near military zones. Insurance companies quietly updated risk assessments. Flight paths were remapped across cities. The word aero risk entered public vocabulary, not from a textbook, but from shared trauma. Meanwhile, survivors struggled in the margins. Families of the dead received compensation, small, hurried checks handed out with official apologies. But no amount could fill the crater left in their lives. Some sued, though the military's legal immunity made court victories rare. Others tried to move on, building shrines in their homes or setting up small foundations in their children's names. Yet one father, a former mechanic himself, refused the easy path. He began gathering documents, photos, flight logs. He filed right-to-information requests, wrote editorials, and coordinated with international aviation experts. His home became a war room of truth-seeking. In interviews, he never raised his voice, never begged for pity. He simply asked a question: if our military jets can kill my daughter on her lunch break, who else is walking under broken wings? The question struck a nerve, not because it was poetic, but because it was uncomfortably literal. In a country where modernization is the mantra and GDP growth the political drug of choice, the idea that death could descend from above, not from terrorists, not from foreign attack, but from our own engines, was too cruel to ignore. It was also too true to deny. As civil society grew louder, so did the echoes abroad. International aviation safety bodies began monitoring military activity in civilian areas more closely. Human rights organizations published quiet reports drawing connections between militarization and urban vulnerability. And perhaps most significantly, a few smaller nations began sharing their own cover-ups, their own too-close calls. The Bangladesh jet crash had become a cautionary tale and a mirror, one in which everyone could see the cost of silence. In that mirror, policymakers saw years of deferred decisions. Generals saw overconfidence dressed as patriotism, and the public saw the fragility of a social contract built on blind trust. Because when trust is breached at 500 miles per hour and 10,000 feet, there's no parachute. As investigations expanded beyond the charred crater on the school's roof, a far more intricate and chilling picture emerged, one not merely of negligence, but of an entire institutional culture engineered to ignore risk. Inspectors combed through hangar records at Tejgain and Kermitil air bases. What they discovered wasn't a logbook here or a corrupted report there. It was a decade-long tapestry of systemic decay. Dozens of maintenance orders had been delayed, falsified, or quietly canceled. At least 3 similar jets had experienced mid-air malfunctions in the past year alone, but these incidents had been buried with euphemistic labels like routine stress response or expected turbine anomaly. Pilots had filed complaints, many in fact, but they were routinely ignored or punished. Engineers spoke of parts laundering, in which defunct jet components were swapped between units without proper testing, under pressure to meet readiness quotas dictated not by safety, but by public relations. The brass had always wanted to project a narrative. Bangladesh had entered the exclusive club of air-capable regional powers. Reality was irrelevant. It was military theater staged with second-hand costumes and a faulty backdrop. But when the audience included real families, real children, the cost of the performance became unbearable. Abroad, the story took on new life. International aviation analysts began featuring the Bangladesh crash as a grim case study at safety conferences. The UN's International Civil Aviation Organization quietly circulated a briefing titled, "Dual-Use Urban Airspace and Emerging Military Risk." No names were mentioned, but no one missed a reference. Behind closed doors in Singapore and Geneva, diplomats began raising subtle but pointed concerns during bilateral talks. Should we be worried about shared intelligence programs if your aircraft aren't safe to fly? Should we continue selling you radar components if you can't maintain them? Meanwhile, in Dhaka, the government scrambled to reframe the disaster. Ministers began emphasizing future readiness and deep reforms, as if the fire had already purged the rot. Press conferences were held with slick slideshows showing colorful new training protocols and bright, smiling engineers in clean jumpsuits. But few were convinced, especially not the urban residents now living under daily sonic booms. Neighborhood committees formed spontaneously, demanding new zoning laws. They lobbied for relocating all flight paths away from schools, hospitals, and residential high-rises. City council meetings turned heated. At one, a grandmother stood up and shouted, "If they want to fly over our children, let them build their runway over Parliament first." The remark made national headlines. It also became a chant at marches. Protesters carried cardboard models of fighter jets with the words "State Failure" spray-painted across the wings. Students posted grainy footage of military overflights, tagging them #Wings of Shame. It was no longer just about a jet. It was about who was allowed to put lives at risk and walk away with medals. Within the military, internal fractures deepened. Junior officers began leaking more details anonymously. Training sessions had skipped key safety drills. Simulators were outdated. Political loyalty had trumped technical skill and promotions. A young Air Force captain, in a text thread later published by a journalist, wrote, "We've been told to keep the birds in the air at all costs. Now we see the cost." One particularly damning leak revealed that the ill-fated jet's radar system had been jury-rigged using components purchased off eBay, yes, actual eBay, by a subcontractor with 0 military certifications. It would have been farcical if it weren't deadly. The firm, which had billed the government millions, vanished overnight. Investigators claimed they were pursuing leads. Most citizens assumed the leads had been quietly buried beneath layers of plausible deniability. Internationally, reputational fallout spread like wildfire. Regional allies grew cagey. Western defense contractors postponed scheduled talks. Joint military exercises were scaled back or rebranded as technical consultations. Even neighboring India, which had long maintained cordial ties with Bangladesh's Air Command, issued an unusually blunt statement about the importance of stringent aviation protocols in urban zones. Translation: we're watching, and we're nervous, but perhaps the most striking shift occurred not in Parliament, nor in the skies, but in classrooms. Across Bangladesh, students began holding weekly drills, not for fire or earthquakes, but for airstrikes. Teachers downloaded military radar tracker apps and taught students how to listen for jet engine types. Art classes turned into poster campaigns. One 9-year-old's drawing, widely shared on social media, showed a school with wings and parachutes labeled Plan B. The caption read, "If the jets don't move, maybe we should." It was satirical. It was tragic. It was also prophetic. For if nothing changed, the children might one day have to fly to safety, away from the ground their leaders claimed to protect. And yet, in the haze of outrage and absurdity, something rare began to stir, a sustained reckoning. For the first time in decades, military immunity was not treated as sacred. Politicians who had once posed in front of jets during campaign season now ducked reporters' questions. Civil lawsuits, once seen as futile against military defendants, began crawling their way through the courts, backed by new public interest lawyers and sympathetic judges. Whistleblowers found unlikely allies in tech-savvy youth movements. A quiet revolution was brewing, not with tanks or slogans, but with facts, questions, and a refusal to forget. Because memory, once awakened by injustice, doesn't go back to sleep. And in this new, uneasy Bangladesh where shadows of jets stretch across playgrounds, memory had become a force more powerful than fear. The reckoning did not arrive with the sound of sirens or the roar of engines, but with the shuffle of documents, the hum of projectors in parliamentary hearings, and the sudden clarity of voices that had long been dismissed. As the National Inquiry Committee convened in a chamber thick with cameras and suspicion, it became clear that the aftermath of the crash had transformed into something far more consequential, a national confrontation with its own institutional rot. The committee, chaired by a retired Supreme Court justice known for neither patience nor fear, quickly established a tone of ruthless efficiency. No euphemism was tolerated. No time was wasted on empty condolences. The sessions were televised, raw and unfiltered. On the second day, a former Air Force mechanic took the stand and in a trembling but unwavering voice declared that he had been ordered to sign off on inspections that were never performed. "They told us to fix problems with signatures," he said. "So I did. Or I'd be transferred." The room fell silent. He held up a grease-stained maintenance log, pointing to falsified entries. "This one," he said, "is the jet that fell." Gasps rippled through the chamber. For once, the bureaucracy had a human face, a trembling hand, and a trail of ink that led to death. From there, the floodgates opened. A young air traffic controller confessed that she had submitted multiple risk assessments warning of dangerously low flight altitudes over Dhaka, but had been ignored. An internal military memo from 3 years prior, stamped confidential and leaked by an anonymous source, included a chilling prediction: the risk of catastrophic failure in urban airspace is rising. Political fallout could be severe. The document ended with a cynical note: recommend delay in public release until after election cycle. It was, in short, premeditated denial. When the Minister of Defense was called to testify, he attempted the usual dance, talking points, deflection, patriotic appeals, but the committee was having none of it. "How many warnings did your office receive before this incident?" the chairwoman asked. "We received many communications," the minister mumbled. "Some are not credible." "Were they credible enough to warrant hiding from the public?" she shot back. He blinked. The transcript would later record a pause of 15 seconds before he replied, "I declined to answer on the grounds of national security." The audience groaned. The hashtag declined to answer began trending within the hour. But perhaps the most damning moment came not from a military insider or a politician, but from a grieving father. His daughter had died in the school's science lab, her notebook still open on the periodic table. He stood before the committee holding her last homework assignment. "She wrote about the laws of motion," he said, voice cracking. "She didn't know one day motion would kill her." He didn't ask for revenge. He asked for competence. It landed like a thunderclap. Outside the hearing chambers, change had begun to ripple. Civil engineers were called in to audit every public building within 10 kilometers of military air corridors. The findings were horrifying. Dozens of schools built with minimal structural resistance to sonic shockwaves, hospitals lacking blast-proof glass, and urban airspace modeling that had not been updated since the early 1990s. A moratorium was imposed on all non-essential military flights over populated zones. Fighter jets were relocated to bases in less congested areas. For the first time, an independent civilian body was granted oversight over Air Force operational planning in peacetime. Some generals threatened resignation. To the surprise of many, the government let them go. Public support for the changes remained overwhelming. It wasn't just anger, it was clarity. For decades, the military had occupied a sacred pedestal in Bangladeshi politics, shielded from criticism by nationalism and necessity. Now, for the first time, it was being treated as an institution like any other, capable of good, vulnerable to rot, and answerable to the people it claimed to protect. International observers noted the transformation with cautious optimism. The European Aviation Safety Agency offered technical support for restructuring Bangladesh's defense aviation protocols. The UN Special Reporter on Human Rights and Armed Conflict issued a statement calling the inquiry a potential model for accountability in post-colonial civil-military governance. Meanwhile, within Bangladesh, a new generation of civil servants, engineers, and civic activists began organizing workshops, educational campaigns, and public consultations about urban safety, defense oversight, and risk mitigation. Architecture schools held competitions for defensive civic design. What had begun as tragedy was becoming blueprint. Still, the resistance was not over. Several high-ranking officers refused to cooperate with inquiries. One retired air marshal gave an incendiary interview claiming the whole investigation was a witch hunt fueled by weak-willed civilians who don't understand sacrifice. His remarks were met with derision. Sacrifice, people replied, is when you risk your life to protect others, not when you risk your life to protect your ego. Quietly, whispers of deeper rot circulated. Rumors emerged of arms procurement scandals tied to the same contractor who had sourced the jet's faulty navigation components. Swiss bank accounts, phantom companies, a paper trail possibly leading all the way to a former prime minister's defense advisor. Investigative journalists began circling like vultures. But amid the haze of political intrigue and institutional damage control, a truth had emerged, undeniable and heavy. Bangladesh was no longer willing to be a passive participant in its own tragedies. The crash had created a wound so deep it bled clarity. The people, once spectators, had become auditors. And though the jet had fallen in seconds, the echoes of its fall were now being measured in movements, policies, and an irreversible change in the air. It was in the sweltering heat of late July that the reform engine shifted from committee rooms and press conferences to the long, grinding gears of lawmaking. Parliament, once known for its operatic shouting matches and theater-level walkouts, became an unlikely crucible for change. A multi-party aviation reform bill, unthinkable just months ago, suddenly found itself with the votes it needed, not because of any new alliance, but because no one wanted their name attached to obstruction. The proposed law was sweeping. It called for a complete demilitarization of urban air corridors, mandatory black box transparency for all military flights over civilian areas, a civilian military oversight council with veto power over training schedules, and perhaps most radically, legal liability for government agencies found to have ignored safety recommendations. In other words, the entire architecture of impunity was being stripped brick by brick. Military representatives tried to insert amendments under the guise of national security, but every clause they pushed was met with a louder question: whose security? For the first time, the question was rhetorical in name only. The debate became emblematic of a broader civil awakening. Law students across Dhaka watched live streams of the legislative hearings in packed lecture halls. Newspapers published annotated versions of the bill on their front pages. Radio stations ran phone-in shows letting citizens debate specific clauses. Bangladesh was litigating its trauma in public, and it was exhilarating. But change, as always, had its enemies. Behind closed doors, several former Air Force commanders coordinated a whisper campaign. Retired colonels appeared on television to warn that these reforms would cripple our national defense capabilities and invite foreign interference. Social media bots posted manipulated videos of foreign jets violating Bangladeshi airspace, insinuating that reform would lead to invasion. But the narrative didn't stick. The public, for once, had receipts. They had committee transcripts, leaked emails, expert analysis, and most importantly, a shared grief too fresh to ignore. The reform bill passed with 87% approval. What followed was a purge, albeit one dressed in procedural camouflage. Nearly a dozen senior defense officials were reassigned, retired, or quietly investigated. Some were found to have stockpiled bribes in crypto wallets. Others had rigged procurement deals for spare parts that never arrived. A few had simply looked the other way too many times. For years, these figures had strutted through life as untouchables. Now, they shuffled out of office like men leaving a funeral. At the Ministry of Civil Aviation, a new department was created, the Directorate of Civilian Risk and Military Flight Impact. Its mandate was ambitious, to redesign the very relationship between Bangladesh's defense needs and its crowded and chaotic urban reality. Architects, data scientists, and former pilots sat side by side modeling flight paths that curved around population clusters. New training bases were planned in less populated areas, with simulators replacing live drills wherever possible. Meanwhile, in the skies, something else changed. Where once fighter jets had torn through the horizon with unchecked impunity, now every flight was monitored not just by radar, but by an independent civilian dashboard accessible to accredited journalists. For the first time, the air belonged to the people again. Down below, the school that had been destroyed was being rebuilt, but not as it once was. The new building was a collaboration between local artists, trauma counselors, and urban safety engineers. It would include a memorial garden where the crash impact had occurred, a soundproof underground shelter for emergency drills, and a rooftop observatory where students could track aircraft movements. "We want our children to be aware of the sky," the principal said, but not afraid of it. The reconstruction drew international attention. Japanese safety experts, South Korean urban planners, and Swedish trauma educators arrived to consult. Donations flooded in, and yet not everyone was ready to move on. Families of the victims, while appreciative of reforms, still demanded justice that wasn't merely systemic. "We want names," one mother said at a televised town hall. "We want people held accountable, not just job titles changed." Her words sparked a second wave of pressure. Lawsuits were filed. 2 military contractors were subpoenaed. A senior air marshal was arrested trying to flee to Dubai. Whistleblowers, once anonymous, now took pride of place on panels discussing transparency and governance. For decades, the idea that Bangladesh's military might one day be subordinated to civilian oversight in peacetime had been laughable. Now it was doctrine. But perhaps the most profound shift was psychological. Citizens who once rolled their eyes at government promises now demanded implementation timelines. Students wrote term papers on urban vulnerability mapping. A children's book was published explaining aviation safety in Bengali using cartoon planes and a wise old owl named Captain Clear Sky. And in living rooms across the country, families no longer saw military jets as symbols of protection, but as reminders of responsibility. Something deeper than policy had changed. A social contract had been rewritten, not by elites, but by collective grief converted into action. The crash had not just restructured institutions, it had restructured belief. In the end, it was never really about one jet, one school, or one moment. It was about how a country faced its own fallibility, looked into the wreckage, and decided that healing would not be private or quiet, but structural, public, and irreversible. And yet, even as the dust settled, one question remained, unspoken but looming. What if the reforms don't hold? What if time blurs the edges of pain and the machinery of neglect creeps back in? What happens when memory fades faster than policy can root? The answer lay ahead in the most uncertain terrain of all, time. But time, as it turned out, wasn't going to allow anyone to forget so easily. Just months after the sweeping reforms were passed and heralded by the press as the beginning of a new Bangladeshi sky, a sudden mechanical failure aboard a privately operated freight drone caused it to lose altitude and crash into an empty warehouse near Chittagong. There were no casualties, no flames, just a smoking crater and a groan from the national psyche. Yet the incident was enough to trigger a cascade of fear. Had all this effort, these commissions, these regulations, these restructurings only chase one beast while ignoring another? Because here was a new threat, dressed in a different uniform, civilian aviation tech, unregulated, experimental, and increasingly everywhere. The irony wasn't lost on the public. After all the noise about military jets and radar control, it was an autonomous vehicle that punctured the illusion of safety. Parliament scrambled. The Aviation Authority, now under civilian leadership, issued an emergency directive banning all non-certified drone flights within city limits. But this wasn't just about air traffic anymore. The question had grown legs and learned to run. If tech companies could develop airborne systems with no public oversight, if state institutions couldn't track them effectively, if AI pilots didn't understand school zones, then who really controlled the skies? Activists once focused on military reform pivoted to digital aviation. Think tanks warned of the new aerotechnocratic elite, startup founders with more influence over national airspace than elected officials. A viral expose by an independent journalist uncovered a cozy relationship between a major drone manufacturer and a top aviation ministry bureaucrat. The new directorate that had been praised for its transparency suddenly found itself flooded with RTI requests. The trust that had been so painstakingly built began to fray. Not unravel yet, but fray invisibly. Meanwhile, global attention shifted. Foreign delegations that once came to study Bangladesh's reform model now asked tougher questions. Were the new safety metrics robust? Were independent audits truly independent? Had the emotional force behind reform been institutionalized, or was it fading like all emotions do? In public discourse, the tone grew sharper. Where once there had been tearful tributes and hopeful slogans, now there were op-eds with titles like, "Did we trade one danger for another?" and "The drone problem no one wants to solve." Students who had campaigned for air safety found themselves at climate marches instead, realizing that air regulation was a symptom, not the disease. The narrative was shifting again, and quickly, and in the center of this evolving storm was the Air Crash Memorial School. It had reopened with much fanfare, its mural-covered walls and glass-ceilinged atrium drawing admiration from architects around the world. Children filled its classrooms again, giggling, chasing each other through the memorial garden, pointing telescopes skyward without fear. But at the school's annual parent-teacher meeting, a strange silence settled when one father, a software engineer, asked the principal if there was any protection against drones malfunctioning near the school. "No," she said. "Not yet." There was a small moment, a quiet one, but it rippled. The illusion that progress was linear cracked at the edges. For every mile moved forward, there were inches of slippage. Yet there was something different this time, too, a social muscle that had been exercised. The community didn't fold in on itself. It activated. Teachers sent a petition to the local council. Students built a low-cost drone detection device as part of their science fair. The local paper ran a month-long series titled "Mapping the Invisible Civilian Air Threats in Bangladesh." A coalition of parents, engineers, and policy nerds formed what they called the Sky Safe Collective. They didn't wait for tragedy this time. They moved before the breach. Because this, it turned out, was the real legacy of the crash. Not just policy, but posture. A national readiness to confront risk, not with fatalism, but with framework. It wasn't perfect. Progress never is. But it was deliberate and shared. Even the military, now quieter and more cautious, submitted a proposal to collaborate with the Sky Safe Collective on real-time airspace coordination. It was unprecedented and possibly motivated by optics, but it was still movement, and movement mattered. Still, there remained a kind of existential undertow. The country had awoken to one layer of vulnerability only to discover another and another and another. Like peeling an onion made of jet fuel and bureaucracy. At what point does a society become exhausted by vigilance? Or worse, numb? That question hovered like an unregistered drone over every meeting, every speech, every policy draft. Because beneath the surface optimism was a deeper truth. The crash hadn't just revealed a fault in air systems, it had exposed the fragility of systems, period. Every safeguard felt temporary, every victory conditional, but also every failure now had consequences. That, too, was change. As Bangladesh prepared to host a regional aviation safety summit, officials hoped to position themselves as leaders in proactive oversight. Delegations from India, Thailand, and even the UAE were invited. The slogan? From wreckage to blueprint. It was catchy, but more importantly, it was earned. Not by ministers or generals, but by parents, students, journalists, and those unwilling to normalize the sound of disaster. Because in the end, safety wasn't about silencing risk. It was about making sure the sky, once weaponized, once ignored, once ungoverned, could be watched, questioned, reshaped. Not by heroes, but by citizens. And maybe that was the most radical change of all. By the time the International Aviation Summit convened in Dhaka, the city bore little resemblance to the anxious capital it had once been in the immediate aftermath of the crash. New radar towers dotted the outskirts. Unmanned aerial traffic control centers ran quietly behind reinforced glass, and the airspace above the city had been sectioned into color-coded digital zones, green for certified aircraft, red for emergencies, yellow for test flights, and a narrow cobalt ring surrounding all schools, hospitals, and public events where even a migratory stork triggered a notification. It was a new kind of sovereignty, algorithmically enforced, citizen-audited, and manually complex. Delegates from across Asia arrived with a mixture of curiosity and skepticism. Could Bangladesh really go from poster child of bureaucratic decay to beacon of regulatory innovation in under 2 years? Was this summit a celebration of national resilience or just a well-dressed public relations exercise to distract from deeper instability? The answer, as always, was both. The first morning began with an opening address from the Prime Minister, who, more stateswoman than politician now, spoke not about strength or vision, but about grief. She named the victims of the crash, all 51, paused, and said, "Their names are our coordinates. We move forward only by staying tethered to where they fell." It wasn't slick. It wasn't even widely televised. But inside the conference center, a strange quiet followed. Because the usual metrics, flight delay statistics, fatality curves, fiscal transparency indexes, suddenly felt like footnotes to something more human. Over the course of the summit, the attendees were walked through Bangladesh's entire regulatory revamp. But what impressed the foreign delegations wasn't just the hardware or the data. It was the structure of accountability. Civilian oversight boards made up of former victims' family members. Open-source audit trails published monthly. An aviation ombudsman with subpoena power, even a public grievance app called Sky Voice that allowed citizens to flag unsafe or suspicious aerial activity in real time. The idea of turning sorrow into surveillance had once felt dystopian. Now it felt like the minimum. In breakout sessions, Bangladesh's bureaucrats were peppered with questions. How did they push reforms through a previously militarized system? How did they avoid sabotage? Were there risks of overregulation? Could their models scale to other countries without the same tragic catalyst? Meanwhile, outside the summit, the city thronged with its usual contradictions. Rickshaws weaved between Teslas. Rooftop gardens flourished beside neon-lit billboards for crypto startups. And above it all, the sky. Noisier now, but somehow safer, hummed with monitored motion. Drones delivering medicine. Piloted helicopters shadowing infrastructure repairs. Even a solar-powered glider circling overhead as part of a student project. In this new Bangladesh, the sky had become a shared commons, not a forgotten void. But there remained tension. Not everyone celebrated the changes. Some civil liberties groups warned of creeping surveillance. Religious leaders questioned the morality of embedding AI in enforcement decisions. One aviation union accused the government of outsourcing too much to foreign consultants. And within the military, whispers of resentment persisted, reduced budgets, diminished authority, a sense that they'd been publicly scapegoated for a systemic collapse. And perhaps they had. But history rarely grants tidy resolutions. What mattered more was that for the first time in decades, the story of aviation in Bangladesh wasn't just about what had gone wrong, but what had been rebuilt from it. That story would soon be told around the world. A European documentary team began filming a series called After the Crash, starting with Bangladesh. A South Korean university announced a joint research project with BU to study real-time airspace risk mapping. And perhaps most tellingly, the International Civil Aviation Organization quietly proposed new guidelines modeled after Bangladesh's 3C doctrine: coordination, civilian oversight, and community feedback. It was in many ways a geopolitical redemption arc. But as with all such arcs, its staying power would depend not on policy but on memory. Would Bangladesh remember the names of the fallen when the headlines faded? Would future governments keep these systems alive or dismantle them in the name of efficiency? Would vigilance decay into complacency as it had before? Those answers remain unwritten. But on the final day of the summit, something unexpected happened. A girl, 7 years old in uniform, walked onto the main stage. She was a niece of one of the crash victims. Not famous, not rehearsed. She just walked up, holding a hand-drawn poster. On it, a child's sketch of a sky filled with planes, birds, and drones, and beneath it the words, "Please fly nice." The room fell silent. No graph, no applause, just a pause. And maybe that's what it all came down to, not the technology or the reforms, not the scandals or the budgets, but the simple plea of a child who understood that flying, like power, should be gentle. So what if the Bangladesh jet crash hadn't happened? Perhaps the victims would still be alive, but the system would have remained asleep. The air above Dhaka, silent, unmonitored, fatal. Instead, the crash cracked open a nation. It hurt, it exposed, it humbled, but it also remade. And in that painful alchemy of failure and reform, Bangladesh taught the world something both terrifying and beautiful, that sometimes catastrophe is the price of consciousness, but only if we choose to stay awake. This has been What If Horizons. If you found this episode meaningful, share it, discuss it, question it, and most importantly, keep your eyes on the sky, because the next reform begins with you.